international people. This is Louise Uachu, broadcasting live from Vancouver, Canada. This is 5 p.m. and this is the first day of November. Happy November. Oh my God, we are done with the year. It's almost here. Wow, I can't wait to say goodbye to 2012. Now, today on the show, it's going to be really interesting, especially right before the American elections. We are talking about guns versus rights. Your gun rights. Gun rights are different around the world. Today, we'll talk particularly the case of America, and we will talk about who's the better candidate for your guns. Who is the better candidate between Obama and Romney? If you love your guns or if you don't love your guns, we will find out. Now, let me bring in our expert author today, and he will definitely school you on what's happening. Good evening, Mr. Clayton Kramer.
Good evening there.
Thank you for being on the show. I know you're in an uncomfortable situation right now.
Well, it could be worse. I was on my way home, and it was either stop on this side of the dead zone for the cell phone, or hope that I got through the dead zone on the other side. So I figured, what the heck? If I'm going to be in the car either way, I might as well be on this side of the mountain.
Thank you for being with us. It proves that we can really do the show from anywhere with anyone.
Yes.
Yes. So where are you anyways?
I am just north of Boise, Idaho.
Wow.
I live in on the mountains above a small town in some distance north of Boise, and I was on my way home from my day job when you called.
Mhm. Now, Mr. Clayton Kramer, is that your real name? It sounds like we were just saying, it sounds like a really cool movie name.
No, I'm afraid it isn't anywhere near that exciting. My parents, I'm not exactly sure how they picked the name Clayton. I think it may have been because of the actor Clayton Moore, who's been very popular on the television series The Lone Ranger. Mm-hmm. And, of course, the last name is, something that's been handed down for some generations now.
I see.
But was definitely my birth name.
Okay.
The one that no one seems to be able to spell.
It's very nice. Eventually, when you start making movies with all these interesting books that you have, people will think it's a name that you made up for yourself. So, you have a lot of books. I mean, you're a great writer and a great researcher. But the topic that we are currently going to address today is gun rights in America, for which you've written several books and papers, published a lot of papers about it. Can you tell us how your journey started for this cause, for the cause of guns and gun rights in America?
Well, originally, like a lot of people my age, I was generally pretty uninterested in guns, and I didn't understand why anyone felt any great need for them. But I was living in Los Angeles in the late 1970s, is when I was growing up, and suddenly it seemed like there were an awful lot of people I knew that were being victims of pretty major crimes. It reached the point where my wife and I just realized that we were among the very small number of people that had not been the victims of really quite horrible crimes. Crimes where people got raped, kidnapped, beaten, murdered, just awful things. And I began to realize that by the time you call the police and they actually show up, sometimes it's a little late. Mm-hmm. And to be honest, the other thing that was sort of startling is when I started actually looking into the state of gun control law where I lived in California, I was surprised that it was actually quite a bit more restrictive than I had assumed. There's an awful lot of assumptions that people make about gun control laws in the United States that turn out to be often quite wrong. Especially back then, the laws were actually much more restrictive than most people realized. And even today, there are a lot more laws on the books that sometimes work but usually don't, that many people are really quite surprised, especially outside the United States. There's a perception that it's all laissez-faire, that you can go into a store and buy a gun on a moment's notice anywhere, and that is actually not really the case.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're in Canada. We think that that's what you guys do.
Yeah, and I have some Canadian relatives, and when they come down here, and the discussions are often quite entertaining, because their perception of America is fairly inaccurate in that respect. The other thing people also don't realize is that there are parts of America that have really quite severe violent crime problems, but there are other parts that are quite comparable to most of Canada.
Mm-hmm.
Where I live in Idaho, it has typically violent crime rates comparable to provinces like Alberta.
Mm-hmm.
And we have very, very, very little in the way of gun control in Idaho. The major thing that determines violent crime rates isn't availability of guns. It tends to be cultural values that largely determine how violent people are.
Uh-huh. So now, where do the gun rights come from in America?
Well, that's the interesting thing. Most people also don't realize this. Most people are aware that the U.S. Bill of Rights has a provision in it that guarantees a right to keep and bear arms, but the language of that, with some modification, is borrowed from the English Bill of Rights of 1689, and that was adopted at the time that King James II was given his walking papers by Parliament and told to leave. And a new king, King William, came over from the Netherlands to become the new monarch. Parliament had its objective to make sure that the new king did not get too overly sure of himself, and reminded him that there are limits to your powers, and that was one of those limits. Mm-hmm. It was intended to make sure that the population would be in a position to rise up in rebellion against an oppressive king if need be, and similar motivations drove the addition of that provision to the U.S. Bill of Rights, is a concern that this new, more powerful central government might someday become one-tenth as powerful as it actually is now, and that there might be some real danger if the population were not in a position to fight back.
I see. So the other question was going to be, why do we need gun rights? I guess you just answered that. You have, yeah?
Yeah, well, there's really two issues here. One of them, the one that was the primary motivation for both the English Bill of Rights provision and the U.S. Bill of Rights provision, was concern about the dangers of a tyrannical government. And the 20th century has certainly been full of examples of what happens when governments sometimes get too full of themselves and start engaging in genocide. But the other motivation, and this is also something which is pretty well goes back for many centuries in English law, is the notion of a right to self-defense. That there are going to be times when the government is simply not going to be there quick enough to be able to protect you from criminal attack, and that you have a right to defend yourself from that sort of criminal attack. Now, you might make the argument that that doesn't necessarily always make sense to do so. That some people, if you give them a gun, they're more likely to get themselves in trouble than to protect themselves sensibly. But the experience of most countries has been that gun control generally is not passed for reasons of reducing crime, but generally for political reasons. That was certainly the case in Britain when they adopted their Firearms Act of 1920. One of the things that I discovered when I was in grad school, I was researching the history of English gun control laws, was I found a whole bunch of cabinet papers that were declassified in 1969 and 1970. And in those papers, members of the British cabinet discussed that they wanted this gun control law because they were afraid of a communist uprising that was going to overthrow the government. And they even went so far as to say during those discussions that they would have to give a different explanation to the public, that they would have to claim that it was being done for reasons of crime control, but that was not the real purpose.
So if I understand correctly, the gun laws are here because they want to make sure that your government does not get more powerful than its people.
Yes, because while democracy is a wonderful idea, it does not always work perfectly. Sometimes majorities, vote out troublemakers, and those troublemakers simply refuse to leave. Sometimes there is the problem of minority rights. Throughout the 20th century, we had example after example of governments that decided to slaughter whatever minority they had decided to blame for their problems. And in Turkey, it was the Armenians that were blamed. In Nazi Germany, it was the Jews, the Gypsies, and a few other factions. And more recently in Rwanda, we see what happens when one population, when a majority decides it's going to exterminate a minority it doesn't like.
Now, so are you saying that the solution is to arm the population? Like an armed population is a safer population?
There's a trade-off here. One, you're less likely to have the sort of genocidal slaughters that mark the 20th century. There is certainly some increased risk that people are going to misuse firearms. There are going to be people who, because they have intoxication problems, because they have temper problems, should not have a firearm. And I do my best to encourage people here in the United States that, if you are prone to fits of temper, if you are a person who sometimes wakes up and can't remember how you got home, perhaps a firearm is not something would be a wise thing for you to have around the house. But those are actually fairly exceptional. It's typically the case here in the United States. About 1/3 of murders are committed by people who are under 18, who can't legally purchase a firearm. Typically 35 to 40% of murders are committed by people who have prior felony convictions. And surprisingly, a lot of them are actually prior murder convictions who are already back out. And there's another 5% who are typically people with severe mental illness problems, and we have laws designed to prevent people who have been hospitalized against their will from purchasing firearms, and those laws don't work all that terribly well for a variety of reasons. Once you take those three groups out of the picture, that's typically 90% of all murders in the United States.
I see. Wow. Now, speaking of the United States, isn't your government right now more powerful than its people? Isn't your government way too heavily armed, and there's nothing really, despite the fact that the American people have guns, there's nothing that they can do against their government because their government is more armed. So how do you deal with such a situation?
It depends what you mean by more powerful. It's certainly the case that the standing military of the United States is fairly substantial, they could go ahead and carpet bomb cities, and there wouldn't be any revolt anymore. In practice, of course, most governments, even oppressive ones, try very hard to persuade themselves that they're doing a good thing. They really don't want to engage in mass slaughter because at a certain point, even the leaders get up and look in the mirror every morning and say, I'm doing something wonderful. Sometimes if they reach a point where they have to kill big chunks of their population, that tends to interfere with that delusion that they're doing something wonderful. It is interesting that Romania, when Ceausescu lost power, that was a situation where the military or actually more properly the secret police of Romania attempted to keep him in power, and they discovered that they were unable to do so, that even in spite of fairly restrictive gun control laws there, a lot of Romanians actually had guns and managed to use them successfully against the Romanian secret police. And before they knew it, Ceausescu and his wife were being executed by the revolutionaries.
Mm-hmm.
The fact is that in any significant revolutionary activity, if the military perceives that there is a significant risk in going up against an armed population, some significant fraction of that military will change sides. This isn't just theory. In 1877 in the United States, there were a series of quite violent strikes by railroad unions. And in a number of cities, especially back east, the National Guard was called out to suppress these riots. In a number of these instances, the National Guard concluded that, in fact, the Union was not doing anything improper. They were not engaged in any sort of violent activity, and the National Guard actually changed sides. They refused to shoot down armed but nonviolent protesters, and this was one of the advantages. It is certainly the case if a soldier has to choose between obeying orders and maybe getting shot by the people that he's ordered to kill, or changing sides, he may well change sides. On the other hand, if there's no risk in carrying out his orders, he may decide it makes more sense to carry out orders he doesn't like.
Aha! Wow, this is very, very interesting. So the solution, or you're saying that in order to have peace in the world, we pretty much all need a gun.
Well, maybe not everyone needs one, but it is certainly the case that if you have a society where some of the people in power exercise power because of the fact that they have a police force and a military that obeys their orders, it is certainly worthwhile if there is a balance of power. Mm-hmm. Part of what prevented World War III from breaking out between the United States and its allies and the Soviet Union and its allies was that a balance of power was held, terrifying balance of power, without question. Mm-hmm. That balance of power prevented either the Soviet Union from invading Western Europe. They knew that were they to attempt that, the risks would have been enormous, that an all-out war would have broken out.
Uh-huh. Now, how does this work in the case of when America invades another country, and in that country, its population is armed, and they're defending their country, but this population that's armed, they get called terrorists?
Well, it depends exactly what sort of actions you're talking about. Now, it is certainly the case that in Iraq there were people who were attacking U.S. soldiers, and that does not per se make them a terrorist. Someone who is attacking non-combatants, that makes someone into a terrorist. Mm-hmm. And in fact, much of the problem that happened in Iraq and in Afghanistan have involved attacks being done not on military forces at all. Afghanistan, for example, of late the Taliban has been engaged in the practice of poisoning wells at schools that educate girls. Mm-hmm. The reason for that is very simple. The Taliban does not believe that girls should be educated. Mm-hmm. And this is one of their strategies for discouraging the education of girls is, basically kill everyone who goes to a school where girls are being educated. Mm-hmm. That is a clear definition of terrorism. The mere fact that one is engaged in combat operations against members of a military is not necessarily a terrorist act.
I see. So, like when the United States and NATO bomb Libya, and then the Libyan population, which is armed, decides to fight against the United States and NATO, what is that? Is that resistance? Are they exercising their gun rights?
It may, in fact, be resistance. My impression, however, is that what happened in Libya, not necessarily an operation I was in support of the U.S. doing. In that case, the U.S. and its NATO allies were attempting to assist one faction that was attempting to overthrow the government of Libya. As I said, I'm not sure that was entirely a wise decision to have made. As much as Muammar Gaddafi was someone that I found detestable, he at least was no longer much of a threat to the rest of the world. He was primarily a threat to his own population. There is a fairly long history of governments assisting, sometimes with very mixed motivations, revolutionary movements. France, for example, provided both weapons and economic aid to the United States in its fight against Great Britain in the American Revolution. The motivation was not because France was necessarily in agreement with our revolutionary goals. It was an attempt to cause irritation and problems for a country that they were a long-standing enemy of, and that was Great Britain. Mm-hmm. This sort of intervention in other countries' affairs is actually pretty much the norm throughout human history. Whenever one faction sees either an advantage, or sometimes there are genuine high goals in mind. Britain, for example, was a major player in imperialism in Africa for several reasons, but one of them was, especially from the end of the 19th century onward, they were attempting to suppress the slave trade. Mm-hmm. And while there were other things that were driving British imperialism, that was, in fact, a motivation of some importance. As late as 1905, there are travel accounts I've read describing British Army patrols in the Sudan headed out to stop the transportation of African slaves across the Sudan into the Red Sea area, where they were going to be transported to Saudi Arabia. Mm-hmm.
This is very interesting. So now, would you advise other countries to arm their populations?
Yeah, in fact, many other countries have. Switzerland, for example, even though they have somewhat more restrictive gun control laws than they did, say, 50 years ago, they still require most of the men in the country, under, I think, 45 is their militia cutoff age, to have an automatic rifle in the house. Mm-hmm. They issue them a machine gun and ammunition. And of course, the ammunition's sealed up, and it's only supposed to be used in the event of war. But they don't have no objections to them buying ammunition of their own and using it in those rifles for target practice. Mm-hmm. In fact, they strongly encourage it. Norway is another country where a sizable chunk of the population is allowed firearms. In fact, much of Europe, most people don't realize it. Many European countries are actually not all that terribly restrictive. They have licensing rules of various sorts, but most people who have don't have a criminal history or a mental illness history can usually obtain permission to purchase a long gun, and even in a lot of European countries, even handguns, they're more restrictively licensed than in the United States, but they're certainly not impossible for a law-abiding person to purchase. Mm-hmm. Many people confuse British gun control, which is really quite restrictive, with the rest of Europe, and that's really not quite the same situation.
Mm-hmm. I see. Now, what about these countries in Africa, like you were saying, where the government always feels free to kill its own people? Is the solution for the people, the population, and everyone to get their own guns and, put up a fight whenever they get attacked by the militias or their own government trying to kill them?
It's not a perfect solution, but it's certainly better than being hacked to death with machetes, as happened in Rwanda. In a period of a few months, many hundreds of thousands of people were hacked to death with machetes. And this was not just personal disputes going on. This was something where the Rwandan government had radio stations that were on a regular basis broadcasting instructions and directions and encouragement to go out and slaughter the other tribe. These are the sort of situations where if you know that the chances are pretty high that trying to go kill someone might get you killed, it may cause you to suddenly rediscover the advantages of spending more time with your family.
I know. What you're saying is completely right, because actually I am from Rwanda, and I have lived...
Oh, you are?
Yes, I am. And I have lived what you're saying, and I was really young back then, but I had always been wondering, nobody put up a fight. A single child, a child or a child soldier or a homeless person that got a gun, or any vagabond could just show up with their gun and they could hijack an entire family and kill an entire family or do whatever they want just because one person had a gun. And nobody put up a fight because no one was, there was no self-defense because no one had any weapons, defense weapons.
Yeah, and that's exactly the balance of power problem I was talking about earlier. If you could somehow magically disarm everyone of all possible weapons, it might be a little bit more peaceful of a world. The difference, however, is that it would mean that those people who are extremely strong and are in a position to cause enormous suffering with just their fists and their feet, they end up becoming then in charge of people who are not so strong. So there is no such thing as a disarmed population. All you can do is remove one category of weapons, and you will find quickly that they have been replaced with another category.
Very, very interesting. Now, let's get to who is trying to take away the gun rights now, because now the issue is, are you going to have those rights, or is someone trying to take away those rights?
Yes, well, it's very clear that President Obama, even though he has done very, very little on this matter in the first 4 years he's been president, it's very clear that he is, in fact, quite hostile to gun rights. When he first was running for state legislature in Illinois, one of the questionnaires that he answered from one group or another made it clear that he supported a complete ban on the ownership of handguns. Most recently, when he first took office in 2008, the web page that the administration put up of all the things they were planning to do listed a number of attempts to impose restrictive gun control laws. One of them was the proposal to bring back the federal ban on assault weapons, which expired in 2004. More recently, during the second debate with Governor Romney, Obama made it clear that he supported passage of the assault weapons ban. And I guess one of the points that I like to make to people that are trying to decide how to vote on next Tuesday is that it's true that President Obama is unlikely to get any sort of bill passed through Congress that would significantly restrict gun rights in the United States. Congress is not willing to pass such a law. Even most Democrats in Congress have figured out that this is not an effective way to get yourself reelected. In this country, at least, gun rights are widely respected everywhere except in a couple of states out on the coasts. But the difficulty is that much of the progress that we have made on gun rights in the last few years has been because of two decisions by the U.S. Supreme Court. They both first struck down a very restrictive law that the District of Columbia had that prohibited possession of a handgun in your home. And then they struck down a very similar law in Chicago that, again, made it effectively impossible for any law-abiding person to purchase and obtain a handgun in their home. Both of those decisions by the U.S. Supreme Court were decided on 5-4 splits. And I'm pleased to be able to tell you that both decisions cited some of my law review articles in justifying why these laws were unconstitutional. So what happened? So this was a very gratifying thing to see my stuff being cited by Justices Alito and Scalia in the two different decisions. So the concern I have is that President Obama will have the opportunity, very likely, in a second term, to appoint at least one new member of the Supreme Court. There are several who are advancing in age and might decide to retire, and if that were to happen, he might be in a position to replace one of the justices who was part of that 5-vote majority. In that case, there is a real danger that the Supreme Court might reverse itself, 4 or 5 or 6 years down the road. This is probably the single greatest danger that President Obama represents, is his ability to change the Supreme Court's makeup and, therefore, the sort of decisions it is likely to make.
Ah, I see. Now, when you say that Obama supports a complete ban of gun rights, isn't that... Yeah?
There are particular categories of weapons that he has identified that he is concerned about. One of them are the so-called assault weapons. This is a very sloppily defined term that refers to a number of semi-automatic weapons, mostly rifles, that are in fact widely owned in the United States and that have never been terribly commonly misused. But they scare the wits out of some people because they look very much like the automatic weapons that are used by a lot of the world's militaries. They are not automatic weapons. You pull the trigger once for each shot that's fired. But because of the similarity in appearance, there's a lot of panicked people out there. The other area where President Obama admitted during the debate, he admitted that, in fact, assault weapons were not a major problem in places like Chicago. They're not actually a major problem anywhere in the United States. But what he emphasized was what he called cheap handguns. And by that he meant that in the streets of Chicago, in spite of historically very restrictive gun control laws, gang members have made tremendous use of inexpensive handguns to attack each other. And the concern is that almost any sort of measure that is aimed at cheap handguns will, in fact, pretty quickly turn into something quite a bit wider. The term that used to be commonly used in the United States to describe inexpensive handguns was Saturday Night Special. And it's an interesting term, and there's always been a great deal of effort trying to figure out where did this term come from. And it turns out that there was a very racially offensive term that used to be used right into the early 1960s in the United States to describe a wild or raucous party, in which, and the implication was is that black people, if you give them half a chance, will, turn into, wild crazies killing each other. And that term seems to have morphed into the term Saturday Night Special. The original term was, N-Town Saturday Night, and you can very quickly see how one leads to the other. And that's something that a lot of people don't realize is that much of the early history of gun control in the United States was actually an attempt to disarm black people. In the period before the Civil War, most gun control laws applied only to blacks. They were attempts either to disarm slaves or to disarm the relatively small free black population of the United States. The very first law that I can find anywhere in the United States that licensed the possession of firearms was a North Carolina law of 1840 that applied only to free blacks. They were the only ones who were required to have a license to possess a firearm. Everyone else, whites were assumed to have that right, and no one seriously disputed it. In the period after the Civil War, the movement for gun control was primarily something that took place in the southern states, and the reason was that the Ku Klux Klan relied on intimidation and murder to prevent blacks first from voting and then from exercising any economic power. And what happened was is that a number of these freed slaves discovered that the Ku Klux Klan was quite a bit less scary once you put a few bullet holes through their silly costumes. And so much of the early gun control law in the United States takes place in these southern states with the objective of making sure that blacks did not shoot back. There's a decision from the Florida Supreme Court in 1941 where they were debating whether a particular law that required a license to have a firearm in your vehicle or not, whether this was constitutional or not. And one of the members of the Florida Supreme Court explained that that he knew something of the history of the law. And he said this law was never intended to be applied to the white population of this state. He explained that the objective was to make sure that whites in less settled areas of the state would have some confidence that if they ran into a black person, that they could be sure that this person would not be carrying a weapon. And it's interesting that even today, most of the gun control laws in the United States are primarily in large black cities, places like Chicago, or that have very large black populations, like New York City. Historically, places like Idaho and Montana that have never had much of a black population have also never had really any gun control laws to speak of.
Wow. So what does that say about Obama? Does he want people to become slaves again? Is he anti-black, or is he going for dictatorship? What does that say about Obama?
I think what it really says is something that it says about much of the liberal political elite in the United States, and that is they find it painful to admit that this enormous problem that has developed in the black ghettos of the United States is primarily a cultural problem. It's something that has developed in fairly recent times, actually. There was a time, even 40 or 50 years ago, when black ghettos there was a lot of segregation that kept a lot of black people living in these areas, but a lot of them were quite middle class. They were black people who had decent jobs. And when segregation ended in the 1960s, and a lot of the black middle class moved out of these inner cities, out to the suburbs, a lot of the positive role models were lost. A lot of the examples. And there's a pretty compelling case that Charles Murray makes that part of why we went from a situation where most blacks in the United States grew up in stable homes. Mom and dad were there. Now that's pretty unusual. And his argument is that the well-intentioned efforts to expand the welfare state in the 1960s play a major part in causing this collapse of a traditional family structure. And it's had the same effect, although in a somewhat less dramatic way, in the white population as well. I mean, there's now very high illegitimacy rates among not only blacks but also poor whites as well. Rather than confront and admit that a lot of these well-intentioned policies had produced some very destructive cultural results, it's easier to focus on the guns. Because if you blame the guns, you don't have to ask the question, have the values that we have inculcated in our population through the passage of these various expansions of the welfare state, have those actually been what has caused this very destructive effect? I worked with a guy many years ago, a black guy who had grown up in Chicago, and he knew that there was something different about the gang members from people like himself who had also grown up in pretty much the same neighborhoods. And I pointed out to him, if you could walk down the street and you could see a little thought balloon appear above everyone's head that talked about what their family structure was growing up, you would immediately see the difference. Because, in fact, gang members are generally coming out of shattered homes, homes where there is no father or the father's in prison. And unfortunately, young men especially, and this was a problem in white gangs in the 19th century in places like New York and Philadelphia, young men are looking for an approving male role model. They're looking for a father figure. If they don't find one at home, they may find one in a gang. As I said, this is a problem in both white and black society in America today. But in black society, the black ghetto subculture, it has become endemic, and hence the need to focus on the guns rather than asking the harder questions.
Yeah, nobody wants the harder questions. So, what can people do to protect their rights? Because as you say, a lot of people want to take away these rights. Is the solution to elect Romney? Does he really make a difference? Or what is the concrete long-term solution so that people may stay safe from their government?
Well, I think electing Romney is certainly a step in the right direction. Romney does not have a perfect record on this. As governor of Massachusetts, he signed a law that was less than ideal from my point of view, but it was better than what they had before. It's clear that Obama does care about this issue. He cares passionately about it, enough that he went ahead and raised it in the second debate. And it's certainly the case that Canada is beginning to make some progress in this area. The new government went ahead and finally got Parliament to repeal the long gun registry, and which had turned out to be an incredible waste of money that accomplished absolutely nothing.
Yeah.
So it's an encouraging sign. I have hope that Canada, if they can stick to conservative governments for another 20 years, might actually move back to where the United States was 15 years ago. In Canada, Canada until 1934 was not a particularly restrictive society about guns. Even as late as the 1970s, Canadian gun laws were, they were stricter than the United States, but they were not unreasonably so. And Canada was a very well-armed society, even today. Canada has about as many guns per person as the United States does. They tend to be more long guns, hunting guns especially, but they're still a surprisingly well-armed society.
Mhm. Definitely, they don't have machetes. They have real guns.
Yep.
So aren't guns comparable to machetes in these societies where they don't have guns? Isn't the machete their gun somehow?
Well, I mean, in the sense that they're both deadly weapons, yeah, you could say that. There is one difference, and that is that to wield a machete and to be really effective at killing people with it, you got to have a little bit of strength, and you've also got to have a willingness to go out and do really horrible things. I am always amazed when I look at these horrible things that happened in Rwanda and a lot of other places around the world. I say, what sort of person could go and just keep cutting people up and killing them and severing limbs? What sort of person could do something that horrible? I could not do that. Certainly, in self-defense, I probably could, but certainly not to go attack a complete stranger. A firearm has the one great advantage that it does not require you to be spectacularly strong to be able to use it, nor does it require you to be particularly bloodthirsty. I can train pretty much any young woman, no matter how small she is, to pick up and use a handgun and be extremely effective at self-defense with it in an hour or two. I don't know how practical it would be for a woman who stands 5'1" and weighs 95 pounds. I don't know how effective it would be for her to try to use a machete in self-defense against an attacker. I know that if she has a handgun, she will be able to defend herself without any question whatsoever. A guy with a machete were to come chasing after you, and you picked up a handgun and pointed it at him, I suspect the guy with the machete would remember an appointment somewhere else that was really urgent.
Now, the fact is that people are still spilling blood and still killing. Now, what about when the government has drones and fighter jets? I mean, that just like we graduated from machetes to guns, doesn't that mean that we need to graduate from guns to drones and fighter jets? Because if you're fighting, if the purpose of all this was to protect the population because the government may be too powerful, so now the government has surpassed guns, and now they have drones and fighter jets and all these other things that could kill you. I mean, do you now need to add on your rights the right to have drones and fighter jets because that's where the fight is right now? Because if you're fighting with a gun, you might as well be with like the person who used to have these bows and arrows or machetes against people who have guns.
I don't think it's actually necessary to match the government weapon for weapon, and the major reason is that, for one thing, a drone in many respects is simply something that requires a rifle to bring it down. They're not immune from being shot out of the air. The other thing is that even aircraft, they can bomb cities, but if they do so, at a certain point, the pilots have to get out of their planes. And this same thing is true about tanks. Yes, the tank could roll down the street and kill everyone that it wanted, but at some point, the people in the tanks are going to have to come out of those tanks to get gasoline, to get food. At a certain point, you create a situation where you have to actually put boots on the ground. You have to actually walk through a city. You can't just destroy it from a distance, or there's no point in what you're doing. And realistically, there are no perfect solutions on this. I mean, we can only hope that the prospect of resistance, even if it is not completely effective, will be a method by which the people that work for an oppressive government will finally wake up one day and say, I don't think it really makes sense for me to keep doing this. The costs are too high. My conscience starts to bother me. And in a sense, it's sort of like what happened with Mahatma Gandhi in India. His objective, because guns there were very strictly controlled by the British government, his objective was to shame Britain into granting India its independence, and it did work. Eventually, the British realized that they would either have to arrest and imprison or kill vast numbers of people to accomplish their goals, and decided it wasn't worth it. You can use the same tactics without firearms, but it takes an awful lot more people willing to put their lives at risk than if that somewhat smaller population says we're not going to be abused anymore and we're going to fight back.
Mhm. Wow. Thank you so much. I think everybody now understands what this is about, and people can start to arm themselves. Now, you don't just write about guns. You have many books, and your latest book is a book called My Brother Ron, A Personal and Social History of Deinstitutionalization of the Mentally Ill.
Right. And this book is sort of a different sort of book for me to write. It's really two different ideas that I've brought together into a single work.
Mm-hmm.
In the 1960s and 1970s, the United States and Canada, and a few years later, much of Europe, all started on a really well-intentioned effort to deinstitutionalize the mentally ill. That is to say, existing state mental hospitals were emptied out of much of the population. The laws were changed to make it much harder to put a person with a severe mental illness problem into a mental hospital. It's also about what happened to my older brother Ron, who was part of that first generation after deinstitutionalization took place. Mm-hmm. He was in college, and like a fair number of people who have schizophrenic breakdowns, he was a person of high intelligence, and something snapped, and he began to have hallucinations. About 1% of the population suffers from schizophrenia, and these hallucinations sometimes are fairly harmless, but unfortunately, fairly often, the hallucinations lead people with schizophrenia to see and hear things that are really quite scary. Mm-hmm. As an example, there was you may recall this incident that happened in Aurora, Colorado, several months ago. A young man named James Holmes, who was a graduate student at the medical school there, apparently became convinced that he was the Joker. He went into the theater, and he murdered a lot of people. Yeah. And he left an enormous set of explosives set up as booby traps in his apartment. Well, these sort of things happen pretty often, and if they involve a gun and a lot of people get killed, everyone worldwide knows about it. Mm-hmm. But if they don't involve a gun, they don't get very much attention. There was an incident there in Canada a few years ago where a young man was suffering from schizophrenia, killed and ate some of the fellow passengers on the bus that he was holding hostage. Mm-hmm. I'm sure you heard about it.
I've heard about it. I was scared on going on buses for a little while there.
Yes. There was an incident several days ago in Fort Worth, Texas, where a man who had been having hallucinations was convinced that people were poking him with needles and that they were following him around. Very typical symptoms of the hallucinations associated with schizophrenia. He drove his car into the front of a church, started attacking people, grabbed an electric guitar, and beat the pastor to death with it. Ooh. And then was killed when the police used a taser to try to stop him, and he apparently died as a result of it. Mm-hmm. These things happen on a at least weekly basis, sometimes on sometimes close to daily basis throughout the United States, and usually one or two people die. There are several hundred of these incidents a year in the United States, and there are dozens of them a year in Canada. They happen fairly often in Europe as well. The tragedy is that because of this change in public mental health policy, many of these are people who in 1960 or even in 1970 would have been hospitalized when it first became apparent that there was something terribly, terribly wrong and that they needed help. One of the consequences of that in the United States, in particular, and my book mentions this, is not only an increase in murders committed by people with suffering these horrible hallucinations, but also a dramatic increase in homelessness, because many of these people, when they were released from the mental hospitals, were not well enough to maintain a place of their own.
Mm-hmm.
And so, as an example, people freezing to death, the rate of freezing deaths in the United States more than doubled between 1974 and 1984. And a lot of it was because so many of these were mentally ill people who were too paranoid to find shelter. They stayed outside on a cold night and did not survive. And there's a lot of degradation of that we have seen in this country, and I would suspect you probably see this in some of Canadian cities as well, a degradation of urban life, because when I was young, I can't recall ever seeing a homeless person.
Yeah.
Now, they must have been out there, but there were not very many of them. Now they're so common that we sort of ignore them. And the same thing is true of these random acts of mass murder. When I was young, there was one incident in 1966 where, as it turned out, a person who had a brain tumor and some sort of mental illness because of it went up to the top of a tall building at the University of Texas and shot a bunch of people. But it was shocking because it was so rare. It's not rare anymore. It's not even shocking because it is so common, and not just the United States.
Mm-hmm.
Canada has had fewer of them, of course, but they still have them.
Mm-hmm.
You'll recall you may not have been in Canada at the time. There was one in the late 70s that led to the very restrictive gun control laws that Canada now has.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a mentally ill person who went into a university in Montreal and separated the men from the women because he hated the women and shot all the women to death.
Yeah.
And these happen in Europe quite frequently too. In fact, they have a slightly higher rate of these sort of random mass murders by crazy people in Europe than we have in the United States. Partly because of the fact that they do have guns available there, and they tend to kid themselves that because they have some sorts of gun control laws that this is sufficient, and it really is not. The core problem is people with severe mental illness problems need help, and they're not getting it right now.
So how is your brother Ron?
Well, like a lot of people with schizophrenia, as he aged, he became a little calmer, less scary, less violent, and he lives in a small town on the coast of Oregon with my mother, it's worked out so far. But my mother is in her mid-90s, and I'd be very surprised if she makes 110.
Mm-hmm.
I'd be a little surprised. She might make it. I mean, she's like the ever-ready bunny. She just keeps going and going and going. One of these days, Ron is going to be in a position where he will not have her to supervise and care for him. Mm-hmm. And I shudder to think what's going to happen. It may work out okay. It may not. He's actually one of the lucky ones in that my mother was in a position to care for him and keep an eye on him. There are many others that were not so fortunate. You may recall a few months ago down in Florida, there was that horrible case where some guy attacked and ate the face off of a homeless person.
Wow!
He got enormous coverage. It was just the guy who the cannibal apparently was using some sort of drug that sold as bath salts, but was actually intended as an intoxicant. Well, it turned out the guy that he ate the face off of survived. And his family didn't even realize he was still alive. Because 30 years ago, the victim of this horrible crime had a schizophrenic breakdown in New York City. He disappeared. His family could not find him. They assumed that he had died and just didn't know what happened to him. Instead, like a lot of these homeless people, he drifted south where it was a little warmer and became the victim of this horrible crime. There's a lot of these tragedies going on out there. And unfortunately, a lot of people, they've grown up with this. They're not familiar with a world where cities are not awash and homeless people begging for food.
I see. Wow. Thank you so much for all this information. We only have 5 minutes left. Now, what can you tell people about, because you were saying that the problem is not necessarily the guns, the problem is the cultural values. So, what would be the most important cultural values that you can tell people to keep on while they still have their guns? And how would you address that, the issue of cultural values and guns? What cultural values do we need to keep the guns and to keep at peace?
The cultural values that are most important are staying married.
Staying married?
Staying married. One of the greatest tragedies. So many of these young men who are in gangs, looking to prove themselves to the world, what they desperately need most of all is they need a father who is demonstrating what adult men are supposed to do: love their wives, go to work, take care of their family. This is a critically important thing, and if we solve that, we solve a big chunk of the rest of the problems. One of the tragedies that a lot of people don't realize is how much of poverty, which many people assume that poverty causes crime. In fact, the same underlying problems generally cause both poverty and crime. Some years ago, a study was completed that demonstrated that about 90% of people living in poverty in the United States had done one of three things, or had done all three of them. Did not graduate high school, got divorced, or did not marry before they started having kids.
Wow.
If you manage to avoid those three things, your chances of being in poverty are fairly small. And
so graduate from high school, and don't have any children before you're married.
And don't get divorced.
And do not get divorced.
Yeah, I mean, it may be difficult to do those, to not get divorced, for example. There are abusive situations where you don't have any choice in the matter, but those three things are the strongest predictors of whether someone is going to end up in poverty. I teach at a community college here in Idaho, and it's a lot of the kids are kids coming from very screwed up homes, and they're trying very hard to make something of their lives. But many of them, I mean, my wife tells me she reads essays all the time that start out with, "I had my first child at 13." You can imagine the destructive effect that's going to have on someone's ability to get out of poverty if they're already making decisions like that.
Wow, I have definitely. I'm a success. I have avoided all these things that you're saying.
Well, that's
not married yet, though. I'm not married yet.
Okay, well, there's hope.
But I guess I'll be smart enough not to get divorced.
Yeah, and of course the trick to a successful marriage. My wife and I are coming up on 33 years in March. The trick to a successful marriage is two people have to both be willing to not be selfish. You've got to be prepared to do for the other. One-sided relationships with one selfish person and one who isn't, those can work, but they're often very bad for the person who isn't selfish. But two selfish people, those marriages, in my experience, don't last at all. Marriages that work involve two people who are prepared to sacrifice for each other and to do so on a consistent and regular basis.
I see. So we only have a minute left, and I guess there's no point in asking you about gay marriage.
That's a very complicated subject. I could give you a very detailed answer, starting with the first attempts to regulate the definition of marriage in Virginia in the 17th century, but we'd never get it all into a minute. We could certainly do this again some other evening.
Yes, but so what can you say briefly about that kind of marriage then, because
it doesn't really serve any useful function. The purpose of marriage is to provide a legal framework for protecting the interests of the offspring of that marriage. And I guarantee, unless someone masters biology in a way I do not understand, no same-sex marriage has ever produced children. They may have children from a previous marriage, but two men and two women will never produce a child.
Yes. So
therefore, the legal constraint just doesn't it doesn't make sense for the government to have to step in to recognize that relationship.
I see. Wow. Well, thank you so much for all this information. I mean, our audience has heard from you, and you have many other books. One of them, I am on Amazon right now. All people have to do is type in your name in Amazon, Clayton Kramer, and you have Armed America, the remarkable story of how and why guns became as American as apple pie. You have My Brother Ron. You have another book, Concealed Weapon Laws of the Early Republic. And you have Black Demographic Data and Firing Back, which is the one that we've put on the poster for the show today. Firing Back, a clear...
that one's actually a little out of date. It hasn't been, is out of print right now, so you might be better off putting My Brother Ron up there.
Okay. Yeah. So... thank you so much. How can people contact you, and what can people contact you about? What do you want to hear? What's the last thing you tell our audience?
Go to my website, ClaytonKramer.com, ClaytonCramer.com, and that'll take you to my blog.
Yes. Well, thank you so much, Mr. Kramer.
Okay, glad to have been on.
We have been so educated and so informed. Have a great night.
Okay, you too.
Thank you. Wow, my international people, thank you for following. And, the show went on a little bit longer than planned, but, we can't cut conversations, especially when they're that interesting. So now you know about your rights. Get your guns, get your rights. Defend yourself, defend your own. Don't wait for the government to come and kill you. Yeah, and like the gentleman said, do not drop out of high school. Do not have kids out of wedding before you're married. And do not divorce, which means do not marry selfish people. Wow, and don't get married until you're selfless. All right. Wow. This has been so interesting and so educative, and thank you for following us. Once again, this is Louise Uachu broadcasting from Vancouver. Next week, a documentary. Yes, I'll tell you about it next week or during the week. Documentary that I did in Mali, West Africa. Which, by the way, the Mali is currently under attack, So if the people of Mali had guns to defend themselves against those terrorists that are attacking them, maybe we would be getting somewhere. So we'll talk about that in the coming weeks. Have a good night. Stay blessed. Murakoze muramuke.